The afternoon sun cast a faint glow over Washington, D.C. Karoline Leavitt, 27 years old, and the youngest White House press secretary in history, was resting in her luxurious apartment near the White House, a small silver cross on the collar of her navy blue blazer, a mark of faith from her New Hampshire upbringing, glimmered as she stood. Suddenly, her phone rang. President Trump was calling. "Karoline, there's a religious case at the D.C. local court. A group of Christians is suing because they were banned from praying in public. Go now. Observe. Report," he said, his voice urgent, leaving no room for hesitation. Karoline's tidy apartment reflected her discipline, documents neatly stacked, business attire prepared in advance. Today, she had opted for a simpler outfit, blazer, white shirt, black pants, but still wore the cross, a habit as much as a conviction. As Trump's spokesperson, she was no stranger to crisis, but this case felt different. It touched her personally. She quickly jumped into her sleek black SUV, weaving through D.C.'s crowded traffic. NPR blared from the radio, but she turned it off, focusing on the unexpected task ahead. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest updates. Karoline pushed through the glass doors of the D.C. local court, stepping into a stifling, chaotic space. The murmurs of the crowd rang out like an off-key symphony. Citizens awaited minor hearings, traffic violations, contract disputes, while the clacking of keyboards filled the air. She checked her watch. 2:53 p.m., just minutes until the religious case Trump wanted her to monitor. Choosing a hard wooden chair in the middle row, she sat, set down her document bag, and opened her phone to take notes. The silver cross around her neck glimmered beneath the fluorescent lights, though she didn't notice the many eyes suddenly fixed on her. The courtroom wasn't large, but its clutter made it feel suffocating. A middle-aged man wearing a t-shirt that read, "I am king," sat a few seats away, fidgeting with his phone. To her right, a young woman with a necklace, shinier than a chandelier, whispered to her lawyer. Karoline frowned. Clearly, dress codes weren't enforced here. She returned to her task, documenting details of the Christian group suing the city for banning public prayer in a local park. This was a case Trump wanted to turn into a rallying cry for conservatives, and she was his eyes on the ground. The wooden door behind the judge's bench swung open, and Judge Charles Hargrove stepped in. At 62, he carried a rigid demeanor, salt and pepper hair combed back, wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose, his black robe pressed flat, as if just ironed. The crowd fell silent as he sat. His cold, sharp gaze scanned the room. "All rise," boomed James Wilson, the tall, stern-faced bailiff. Karoline stood with the others, her phone still in hand, eyes trained on Hargrove. He banged his gavel. "This is a court of law, not a place to show off personality," he said, his voice deep and cutting like a knife. He called the first cases swiftly. A man fined $50 for illegal parking. No contest. A woman late on rent. Given. A warning. Karoline took notes, noting how Hargrove ran the courtroom like a machine, efficient but cold. She glanced again at the man in the "I am king" t-shirt as he stood to present a neighbor dispute. Hargrove made no comment about his attire. The woman with the oversized necklace was also called. No mention of her jewelry. Karoline's frown deepened. Something felt off. Then Hargrove's eyes landed on her. He paused mid-sentence, flipping through papers. Stalling. His eyes narrowed behind his glasses. Recognition dawning. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone icy but hesitant. The name and the face had clearly registered from White House briefings. Karoline looked up calmly, unfazed. The crowd stirred. A few murmured, recognizing her. "That cross," Hargrove said, pointing to the silver pendant at her collar. His tone was rigid. "It doesn't belong here. This courtroom is a neutral place, not one for displays of faith." Karoline glanced around. No sign prohibited religious symbols. "I'm Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, here to observe a public case for work," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "This cross is a personal item, protected by the First Amendment. It violates no court rules." Hargrove's face tightened. "Work or not, this isn't the place to wear that and stir things up. This courtroom is neutral, not a church." He banged his gavel again, a sharp clap of authority. James Wilson, the bailiff, tilted his head in interest. Mrs. Thompson, the middle-aged court clerk with a tight bun, stopped typing and glanced at Karoline with open curiosity. The man in the "I am king" shirt and the woman with the flashy necklace exchanged whispers. clearly surprised the judge had ignored them, but not her. Karoline stood firm, gripping her phone. She realized instantly, Hargrove wasn't just targeting her. He was targeting the cross. "Sir, I have the right to wear it under the First Amendment," she said again, her voice calm but resolute. "Don't lecture me on the law. Step up to the bench. Now." Hargrove snapped. The crowd held its breath. Karoline inhaled slowly, then walked toward the front of the courtroom. Her heels clicked softly on the old wooden floor. All eyes followed her, the silver cross on her navy blazer catching the light as the moment grew tenser, heavier. The silver cross at Karoline's collar glimmered under the courtroom lights, like a small flame against a gathering storm. Judge Charles Hargrove sat elevated behind the bench, his wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose, his eyes narrowing. A flush of anger spread across his face. "So," he said, his voice low but sharp as a razor, "what exactly are you doing here with that thing, Miss Leavitt?" Karoline didn't flinch. Still clutching her phone, she discreetly tapped the screen, activating the recording feature. "Sir, I'm here on duty, and I have every right to wear it," she replied evenly. Hargrove slammed his gavel. The sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a warning shot. "I've seen your kind before," he growled. "People who think faith gives them license to challenge authority wherever they go. Well, this is my courtroom. And I say it's not allowed." He leaned forward, white-knuckling the gavel. "Do you even realize this behavior qualifies as contempt of court?" Karoline furrowed her brow, scanning the room. The man in the I Am King t-shirt remained unnoticed. The woman with the chandelier-sized necklace whispered freely to her lawyer. Ignored. Yet here she stood, her modest silver cross at the center of controversy. "I'm not disrupting anything," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm here for official work. My attire harms no one. If there's a specific rule against this, I'd like to see it in writing." Hargrove's lip curled into a cold, humorless smirk. "A rule? I am the rule here," he snapped. "You walked into my courtroom wearing that symbol, defying the law, and now you have the gall to demand documentation." He struck the gavel again, this time with so much force that Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, halted her typing and looked up in alarm. The crowd began to murmur. An older man in the back row shook his head and leaned toward his neighbor. "That woman's necklace is 10 times bigger. Why's no one saying a word?" James Wilson, the veteran bailiff, tilted his head slightly as he observed. After 15 years in that courtroom, Hargrove's selective outrage wasn't unfamiliar. The bias was not new, but it was on full display. Karoline drew a steady breath. She understood now that a direct confrontation wouldn't win. Hargrove wasn't debating law. He was asserting dominance. "Sir," she said calmly, "if I've violated a rule, I am entitled to a clear explanation." She subtly adjusted her phone to keep the recording going. Hargrove's expression turned into a sneer. He leaned forward as if relishing the moment. "An explanation?" he said with venom. "Here's your explanation. I'm fining you $500 for contempt of court." The gavel crashed down again, louder than before. A verdict, in sound. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Thompson's hands hovered above her keyboard, uncertain. A young woman leaned to whisper to her friend. $500? Just for a cross? The man in the I Am King shirt let out a soft chuckle, quickly stifled when Hargrove turned a furious glare in his direction. "You will pay today before you leave." The judge continued, his voice taking on the tone of a schoolmaster delivering a scolding. "Maybe this fine will remind you where you are. This is a courtroom, Miss Leavitt, not a church. and certainly not a stage for your personal performance. He leaned back in his chair, smug and satisfied, believing he'd just made a point no one could ignore. Karoline stood her ground, her sharp eyes locked on Hargrove as though she'd just won an unspoken battle. "Sir, I understand your ruling," she said evenly, her voice composed but edged with steel. "But I have the right to ask. Why haven't the others in this courtroom been fined? The printed shirts, the oversized necklaces. Why is this?" She touched the small silver cross at her collar. The problem. Hargrove's face darkened, his grip on the gavel tightening, until his knuckles turned white. "Don't change the subject," he barked. "You're the only one bold enough to bring a religious symbol into my courtroom. That's the difference." Karoline gave a slight nod as if confirming what she already suspected. She didn't speak further, but her silence spoke volumes. Hargrove wasn't simply enforcing order. He was targeting faith. Mrs. Thompson resumed typing, though her hands trembled slightly. In 12 years as Hargrove's clerk, she had rarely seen him issue such a harsh penalty for something so minor. James Wilson, the bailiff, stood with arms crossed, his gaze steady. He'd seen hundreds of rulings under Hargrove. This one felt different. The murmurs around the room swelled. A few spectators stealthily raised their phones, despite the no filming rule. Karoline stood still, phone still in hand, her mind racing. This wasn't just about a fine. It was a window into something much larger. "Are you done, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp as a blade. Hargrove blinked, thrown off by her calm. "Not yet," he replied stiffly. "You'll pay the fine, then I'll move on. Sit down." But Karoline didn't sit. Instead, she stepped forward, placing one hand on the edge of the bench. Her gaze never wavered. "I'll pay," she said quietly, "but we're not done here." Hargrove tried to smirk again, but it faltered. Something about her presence, her certainty, chipped away at his authority. Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, stood tall at the defendant's stand. The silver cross on her navy blazer gleamed like a silent challenge. Hargrove had just fined her $500 for contempt of court. His face burned with false triumph, gavel still clenched. Around them, the courtroom held its breath. Miss Thompson stopped typing again, her eyes darting nervously. James Wilson tilted his head slightly, as if sensing a storm breaking. "Did you hear me, Miss Leavitt?" Hargrove snapped. $500. Payable today. Sit down. We have other business." He slammed the gavel again. Karoline didn't move. Instead, she inhaled deeply, then spoke, her voice calm, clear, and unshakable. "Sir, before I sit, I need to clarify a few things. For the record," Hargrove's brow furrowed. "The record? You've got no right to demand anything." His voice faltered. Karoline's tone never wavered. She reached into her document bag and pulled out a slim, gold-embossed card. She held it up for all to see. "I'm Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, under President Donald J. Trump," she announced. "And what you don't know, Judge Hargrove, is that I don't just speak for the administration. I know the law, too." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The man in the "I am king" shirt gaped. The woman with the glittering necklace leaned toward her lawyer in disbelief. Even Hargrove froze, his hand hovering mid-air over the gavel. "That doesn't change the fact that you broke my rules," he muttered, his voice weaker now. But Karoline stepped closer, her voice rising with undeniable authority. "Your rules, or your personal bias?" she asked. "I'm here on direct orders from the president to observe a religious liberty case. Christians banned from praying in a public park. This She tapped the cross. Is my religious expression protected under the First Amendment? Hargrove opened his mouth to object, but she didn't let him regain control. You fined me for wearing a cross, she continued. So tell me, do you know the law? Church of Lukumi Babalu, I versus City of Hialeah, 1993. The Supreme Court ruled that targeting religious symbols without compelling reason is unconstitutional. She took another step forward. So what's your compelling reason, Judge? Or is it simply that you don't like it? Silence fell over the room like a dropped curtain. Phones were still now, not out of fear, but anticipation. Something had shifted. Despite the courtroom rules, Hargrove opened his mouth. But no words came out. Mrs. Thompson held her breath, fingers frozen above her keyboard. James Wilson gave a subtle nod, eyes bright. He'd seen hundreds of hearings, but never a defendant flipped the script so fast. Karoline pressed on, her voice steady, deliberate, each word landing like a hammer. You fined me $500 for contempt, she said, lifting her phone slightly. But I have proof, right here in this courtroom, that your judgment isn't about the law. She pointed. That man in the I Am King shirt? Graphic print, clear dress code violation. You said nothing. She gestured toward the woman with the oversized necklace. Flashy jewelry, no issue. But my cross? Her hand returned to the silver emblem at her collar. That's what enraged you. She looked back at Hargrove. That's not law, sir. That's personal bias. Hargrove's face shifted, from red to ghostly pale. You're slandering me, he muttered, voice thin, unconvincing. But Karoline didn't stop. I've recorded everything, from the moment you called me forward. This phone has also texted the White House office. The president's legal team is already aware of what just happened here. The crowd stirred. Someone whispered, She's right. A single clap broke the silence before Wilson quieted the room. Hargrove panicked. Miss Leavitt, I can withdraw the fine, he stammered, lifting the gavel with a shaking hand. No need to escalate. Karoline shook her head. No, sir. Withdrawing it now just because of who I am proves my point. The issue isn't just this one moment. It's how you run this courtroom. She stepped closer to the bench. I demand a review of the last 6 months of fines, every penalty tied to religious expression, and I formally propose mandatory First Amendment training for court staff, including you. Gasps rippled. Then, a standing ovation. The older man in the back row stood, clapping and yelling. That's right! A young woman whispered too, her boyfriend. She's amazing, Mrs. Thompson typed furiously, her eyes gleaming. She knew she was transcribing history. James Wilson cracked the faintest smile. He'd sensed it from the beginning. Karoline wasn't just a presence, she was a force. Hargrove slumped into his chair, hands trembling on the gavel. For the first time, he saw Karoline not as a defendant, but as a threat he hadn't prepared for. You think I'm just a spokesperson, Karoline said, voice low, but electric. I've stood with President Trump through lawsuits, press wars, and policy battles. I taught myself the law to defend him. She held up her White House credentials and laid them on the bench. Now I'm using that knowledge to defend myself, and every citizen whose rights you trample. She stepped back, her eyes never leaving him. You just made a very big mistake, Judge Hargrove. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The gavel stayed still. The courtroom erupted again. Applause, cheers, disbelief. Mrs. Thompson typed faster than ever, trying to capture every last word. Wilson stepped closer to the fouche bench, eyes full of respect. Karoline stood tall, The cross at her collar wasn't just a symbol of faith anymore. It was her banner of victory. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun lit up the gleaming silver cross on her navy blazer. The clock read 3:30 p.m., but the air behind her still crackled like lightning. She paused at the glass doors, checking her phone. Recording. Sent. Message to the White House. Delivered. Text. Hargrove fined me for the cross. Handled it. Need next steps. Karoline knew this was no longer personal. This was a national moment and a political opening. Inside, the crowd still buzzed. That was a knockout, the older man said, to his neighbor, still stunned. White House press secretary, whispered another. Incredible. Mrs. Thompson printed the transcript, her hands shaking. James Wilson stepped outside, phone to ear. You've got to hear this, he said to a colleague. She just silenced Judge Hargrove. The news leaked before Karoline even reached her car. The story spread like wildfire. Her phone buzzed. Again and again. Notification from X was crossing court. Trending. She opened the app. The top tweet read, Breaking. Judge fines WH press secretary $500 for wearing a cross. She fought back and won. Watch this space. Karoline smiled faintly. The battle was over. The war had just begun. For wearing a cross, she fought back with the law and left him speechless. Crossing court. Within 10 minutes, the internet was ablaze. Comments flooded X. Who is she? Unreal. Hargrove's done. A major conservative account posted, Proof the system's against Christians. Thank you, Karoline Leavitt. Karoline gave a faint smile. She knew. This wave was just beginning. At 4 p.m., President Trump weighed in personally, from his official account. Karoline Leavitt, my amazing spokesperson, just taught a leftist judge a lesson on religious freedom. Legal genius. We won't let them suppress faith. The tweet exploded. 50,000 plus retweets in under 30 minutes. Conservative outlets pounced. Fox News headline, White House press secretary confronts Judge Overcross and wins big. Her phone rang. It was Trump's senior advisor. You did great, he said, his voice full of energy. The president wants this amplified. Prep a statement. We're going public. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Judge Charles Hargrove sat alone in his chambers. The light was dim, casting shadows over his pale, stunned face. His phone wouldn't. Stop ringing. D.C. Judicial Council. Reporters. Former colleagues. He silenced it. Hands trembling, he stared into a cold mug of untouched coffee. The moment played over and over in his head. He muttered, almost in disbelief. She's just a kid. How did this happen? But deep down, he knew. He hadn't just been out-argued. He'd collided with a storm far bigger than he was ready for. Mrs. Thompson couldn't stay silent anymore. Still at her desk, she picked up the phone and called a friend at a local paper. I've worked with Judge Hargrove for 12 years, she said, voice low but firm. He always targets religious symbols, especially Christian ones. That girl today? She was right. From a drawer, she pulled a worn notebook, page after page of cases. People fined for crosses, warned over Islamic pins. But slogan t-shirts, flashy necklaces, always ignored. Speaking up was a risk. But after today, staying quiet wasn't an option. James Wilson moved quickly, too. In the break room, he gathered 3 colleagues. I've seen it. At least 20 times this year alone. Fines for religious symbols. But someone wears a rude shirt. He laughs it off. He shook his head. Leavitt just said what we were all thinking. One colleague looked up. I'll call the press. This has to get out before 5. By 5 p.m., Channel 7 was live from the courthouse steps. Today, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt was fined $500 for wearing a cross in court. She fought back with the Constitution. And now, the city's erupting. The hashtag #MyCrossInCourt soared past 100,000 mentions. People began sharing their own stories. He fined me $200 last year for a prayer badge. Saw him scold a mom in a custody hearing for wearing a cross. A short, grainy clip emerged. Online, someone had secretly filmed Karoline mid-speech, holding up her White House badge, her voice sharp and commanding. It went viral. 1 million views in 3 hours. Karoline sat in her car, parked off a quiet D.C. street, watching the news unfold in real time. She dialed her husband, a soft-spoken businessman. "Hey," she said, trying not to laugh. "I just shut down a judge." On the other end, a chuckle. "You always pull off something crazy. Stay safe, okay?" "I will," she said, hanging up. A new email popped up from Trump's office. "Prep for press conference tonight. We're turning this into a win." Back in his office, Hargrove turned on the TV. The screen blared. Judge faces backlash after fining press secretary. Overcrosses. Face filled the frame. He turned the TV off immediately. The Judicial Council had already called, demanding an explanation. He stared at the gavel on his desk, his symbol of authority. Now feeling more like a relic, 30 years on the bench. And now his legacy was on the line, all because of a 27-year-old woman. And her tiny silver cross, the Judicial Council's office buzzed like a beehive. News of Karoline Leavitt's courtroom. Clash with Judge Charles Hargrove had swept through Washington, prompting the council to launch an emergency investigation. Linda Martinez, a seasoned investigator with 2 decades of experience, stood before a long oak table laying out dozens of case files from Hargrove's court. Her team had been working non-stop since 6 a.m., following an official complaint filed by the White House office, personally signed by Karoline Leavitt. "We have 48 hours to report," Linda said, voice firm. "Find every instance tied to Hargrove and religious symbols. No detail gets missed." Meanwhile, Karoline sat in her White House office, preparing for that evening's press conference at President Trump's direction. She replayed the courtroom footage, eyes sharp, fingers flying over the keyboard. "I've pulled data from X," she emailed Trump's advisor. "Hundreds accusing Hargrove of bias. Push this hard." Her phone lit up non-stop. Messages from lawyers, reporters, supporters. One stood out from a law student. "You inspire me. Hargrove fined my mom for a cross once." Karoline smiled faintly. This wasn't just her battle anymore. It belonged to thousands. At the courthouse, Mrs. Thompson entered the investigation, room clutching a worn notebook. "I've tracked 12 years under Hargrove," she told Linda, voice trembling but resolute. "He always went after religious symbols, crosses, hijabs, anything visible. But vulgar shirts, flashy chains, always allowed." Linda flipped through the notebook, eyebrows rising. Dozens of entries. September 14, 2024. Man fined $300 for wearing a cross. Disruption. October 20, 2024. Muslim woman fined $200 for wearing a hijab. Inappropriateness. "This is gold," Linda whispered. James Wilson arrived next with a handwritten statement. "I've been a bailiff there for 15 years, he said. Hargrove fined people for religious symbols 3 times more than other dress code violations. I watched him hit 5 people in a single day, all for crosses, but 3 guys in vulgar shirts. Not a word. Linda's team moved quickly, cross-checking with court records. The data painted a clear picture. Over the past year, 70% of fines tied to religious symbols targeted Christians. The average fine? $150, $200, double that of other violations. Judge Hargrove, alone in his home office, faced the Judicial Council via Zoom. His voice was thin, his hands cradling his head. "I didn't mean to be biased," he mumbled. Linda didn't flinch. She laid out the findings. "Mr. Hargrove, records show you fined individuals wearing crosses 80% more harshly than others for similar offenses. How do you explain that?" Hargrove fell silent. His mind flicked back to Karoline, the force of her voice, the clarity of her argument, her command of the First Amendment. "I didn't realize," he whispered. "I thought I was maintaining order." By noon, Linda completed her preliminary report. "This isn't just Hargrove," she told the council. "We found 3 other judges in D.C. with similar, though milder, patterns. But Hargrove is the clearest case of bias against religion, especially Christianity." The council didn't hesitate. Immediate suspension pending final ruling. The news leaked within the hour. X exploded. Cross in court, Dar Hargrove. Suspended, Karoline Leavitt. Shakes the system. Trump's legal genius wins again. One conservative account. Posted at 6 p.m., Karoline stood before the mirror in the White House press briefing room, adjusting her blazer. The silver cross at her collar caught the light. President Trump entered, clapping a hand on her shoulder. "You made me proud. Karoline, tonight, we show them that religious freedom is untouchable." She nodded, then stepped to the podium as cameras flashed wildly. "Yesterday, I was fined for wearing a cross," she began, voice strong and steady. "Not because I broke the law, but because a judge thought he was above it. I fought back, not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been targeted for their faith." Reporters fired questions, but Karoline handled them with ease, citing case law, public data, and constitutional precedent. Judge Hargrove sat in the dock, watching the press conference. His hands trembled. His phone overflowed with messages. Reporters, colleagues, judicial peers, many of them distancing themselves. But what hit him hardest? The testimonies of Thompson and Wilson, people he trusted, people who had finally spoken up. He opened his laptop and typed in, "Church of the Lukumi Babalu Aye Va City of Hialeah," the landmark Supreme Court case Karoline had quoted. He read, then read again. "She's right," he whispered. "I was wrong." For the first time in 30 years, Charles Hargrove felt small. He picked up the phone and called the council. "I'm resigning," he said, voice hoarse. "But I want to help fix this." The small council chamber was quiet. Charles Hargrove no longer wore a judge's robe. His voice cracked, eyes red. "I didn't see my own bias," he admitted. "Karoline Leavitt opened my eyes. I want to join the training. Make sure no one repeats my mistakes." Linda Martinez gave a slow nod. His reversal could be useful. Quietly, she made a note. News of Hargrove's resignation and willingness to undergo First Amendment training spread quickly. Reactions on X were mixed. Some mocked him as a coward trying to save face, but many others praised his humility. "At least he admitted it. That's rare," one user wrote. In her White House office, Karoline Leavitt received Linda's email. "Hargrove has resigned. Agreed to train. You changed him." She looked at her reflection. The SML silver cross on her collar shimmered in the hot light. What had started as a routine court visit was now a movement. The Christian group's case she originally came to observe was no longer center stage. Something bigger had taken root. Just 4 days after that fateful courtroom moment, the air in Washington had shifted. The D.C. Judicial Council announced sweeping reforms. No more bans on religious symbols unless they caused legitimate disruption. Mandatory First Amendment training for all court personnel, from judges to clerks. Linda stood before the council. The Hargrove case proves the need for more transparency. This training is just the first step. A new bronze plaque was mounted outside the courthouse. Religious freedom, a right beyond violation. The hashtag #CrossInCourt continued to trend, and now former Judge Hargrove appeared at the first training session, facing a packed room of court staff. "I thought I was being fair," he said, voice rasping. "But I was wrong. Karoline Leavitt taught me to look at myself. Don't let your bias blind you." The room was silent. Some nodded slowly. Mrs. Thompson, now appointed to oversee court transparency, sat in the front row. James Wilson, leading training for bailiffs, added, "We're the eyes and ears in the courtroom. If we see injustice, we speak up." Hargrove listened, knowing this was only the beginning of atonement, but a necessary beginning. Back at the White House, Karoline framed the $500 fine receipt and hung it on the wall. Not as a trophy, but a reminder. One person can spark change. Trump walked in, clapping her shoulder. "You're a star, Karoline. The religious freedom crowd loves you, and so do I," he said, grinning. "We just scored big. Keep the momentum going." She nodded, already preparing her next speech for a conservative event in Virginia. 5,000 people waiting to hear from the woman, now dubbed the White House's legal genius. What began in D.C. spread far beyond. Texas's governor tweeted, "Thanks to Karoline Leavitt for reminding us what religious freedom really means. Texas will follow." Florida lawyers filed for similar reforms. On X, people across the country posted photos wearing crosses, hijabs, Buddhist bracelets. My freedom. No one can ban it. Karoline read those posts with pride. She hadn't expected a courtroom moment to ignite a nationwide movement. The next day in Virginia, she stood before a roaring crowd. "That day, I just wanted to do my job," she said. "But when a judge fined me for my faith, I couldn't stay silent. This isn't just my win, it's ours." The crowd erupted. Some even chanted Karoline for president. She smiled, waving. Her silver cross sparkled under the lights, soon to become a viral symbol of resilience and conviction. Back in D.C., Mrs. Thompson oversaw new monthly audits of all courtroom fines. James Wilson trained young bailiffs to speak up when something felt wrong. Karoline did. So must we. One evening, Karoline received a handwritten note from Linda Martinez. "You didn't just change Hargrove. You changed the system. Thank you." She set it down and looked again at the framed fine. What once felt like an insult was now a badge of honor. That night, President Trump called. "Karoline, you're my gold," he said. "The opposition's panicking, and we're winning. Rest up. More tomorrow." She laughed. "Thank you, Mr. President. I'm ready." As she hung up, Karoline touched the cross at her neck. What was once just an accessory had become a beacon, a symbol that lit the path forward, not just for her, but for millions. 3 months later, she stood once more at the White House podium, camera flashes blinding. The cross on her collar gleamed, now a familiar symbol across the nation. In front of her stood reporters, TikTok creators, and religious leaders of every faith. 3 months ago, she began, I just wanted to do my job. But when a judge tried to silence my faith, I chose to stand. Today, we stand together. Applause thundered. Across the nation, people stood taller, wearing their faith, their freedom, and their story. Unafraid. Let me know if you'd like this adapted into a short story, screenplay format, or trimmed into a news-style op-ed. Her voice echoed across the crowd, steady and unwavering. When a judge fined me for my faith, I stood up. Not just for me, but for all of you. And today, we've changed the system. Applause thundered through the square. Some in the audience held up signs with Ducks Crossing Court, a symbol of solidarity that had traveled far beyond D.C. Inside the D.C. local court, a new plaque now hung in the lobby. Justice honors all faiths. That night, back in her office, Karoline read a letter from a young law student. "Miss Leavitt, I was scared to fight, but your Cross case gave me courage. I'm starting a free clinic for people discriminated against for their faith. Thank you." Karoline smiled at her reflection in the mirror, knowing she had sparked something in the next generation. Elsewhere, Charles Hargrove, now a volunteer instructor, stood in front of a training class. "I was wrong once," he told the room. "Leavitt taught me. Justice has no room for bias." Mrs. Thompson and James Wilson continued their oversight, ensuring that courtrooms remained transparent, accountable, and fair. One evening, her phone rang. It was Trump. "Karoline, you're my warrior. Keep it up," he said. She nodded silently, feeling not pride, but purpose. The duty was greater than ever. Later, she stepped onto the White House balcony, watching the sun set over Washington. She held the silver cross in her hand, not just a keepsake, but the flame she'd ignited, a fire that began in one courtroom and now spread across a nation. "Freedom doesn't come free," she whispered. "It takes fighters." A message pinged. The Judicial Council was asking her to lead a new National Reform Commission. She smiled. Ready. From one unexpected moment, she had reshaped law, inspired others, and proven a simple truth. One person, one belief, can shake the world. Reflection. The story of Judge fines Karoline Leavitt for wearing a cross, only to discover she's a legal genius mirrors real struggles in today's America. At its heart lies a conflict between personal liberty and systemic authority, a clash we see regularly in legal battles over religious symbols, personal expression, and constitutional rights. Hargrove's fine against Karoline wasn't just about a cross. It revealed how bias, intentional or not, can warp justice, especially when wielded by those in power. Yet Karoline's response was equally revealing. She didn't just object. She documented, argued, rallied, and acted. Her stand, grounded in the First Amendment and the Church of Lukumi Babalu I precedent, reminds us that the Constitution remains a shield even when institutions falter. The viral rise of Ducks Crossing Court, bolstered by Trump's public support, highlights the growing power of digital movements and political amplification. In 2025, activism is no longer just on the streets. It's on feeds, in inboxes, and echoing from podiums. But perhaps most importantly, Karoline's story isn't just about fighting injustice. It's about how to fight, with facts and legal grounding, with courage and clarity, with community and conviction. Even Hargrove's transformation from enforcer to reformer shows what's possible when pressure is paired with purpose. When we hold the line, even those who once stood in our way can walk beside us. In the end, Karoline didn't frame that fine receipt out of pride. She framed it because it proved something bigger. that a small act of resistance, backed by truth, can move a system. That law, when wielded with courage, can still be the people's sword. And that one voice, spoken at the right moment, can echo across a nation.